Hi everyone, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be looking at permissions in detail. As I promised, I'm going to be talking about permissions, the different permissions that are given to us by Django REST Framework, as well as how we can create our custom permissions. So let's get started. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to look into the permissions that are given to us by default in Django REST Framework. The first thing we're going to look at is the allow any permission class. So this is the permission we get that allows us access to any endpoint without having to actually log in. Now we also have the is authenticated permission class, and what this does is to give us access to an endpoint only when we are logged in. We have the is admin user that gives us access to an endpoint in case we are an admin user or a super user in this case. We also have the is authenticated or read only permission class that only allows us access to things such as updating, deleting, or creating objects when we are logged in. And this also gives us access to getting or listing our API resources even when we are not logged in. So we're going to be looking at how to set up this, and we're going to look at how we can also write our own permission classes. So the first question we're going to ask ourselves is, how do permissions work? So we've looked at authentication, we've looked at token-based authentication, as well as GetWT authentication. Now, these are not enough for us to be able to restrict or give access to or control access to the various endpoints of our application. Now, this is where a permission comes in. When we authenticate a user, what we're actually doing is to associate a request with information about the user who carried out that request. Now, based on the user types, we may also have things such as restricting access to authors or restricting access to users who have certain privileges in our application. Now, this is the important thing about permissions. So we're going to look at how permissions can be used to allow access to users on certain endpoints of our applications in this video. So what I'm going to do is to head over to our VS Code right here. The first thing I'm going to go and do is to look at our project folder, which we call the blog. I think we call it the simple blog folder. And within our settings, I'm going to go within our REST framework settings, and in here we can be able to see we set up our default authentication classes as well as our default permission classes. So in here we set our default permission class to be the is authenticated class, and this is to only allow a user to access any of our endpoints only when they log in. So we're going to first test the endpoint for our home page or our Hello World page that we created in the very first video. I'm going to go in our Insomnia right here, and I'll go where we actually call that post home page. So what I'll do is to try to send this request. So we actually don't have any permissions yet. So what I'll do is to actually go and decorate that with permissions. So I head over to the top of our code, and this is the request. So we imported our permission classes decorator. I'll just come right here and decorate it with permission. Sorry for this. So this will be at permission classes. And this is going to take in an iterable or at least containing these different permission classes. Now, if I leave this empty, let's save and see what happens. When I try to make this request, we're going to see that our message is being returned to us. So we can be able to access this without any authentication. So when you go back here, we can actually add also our authentication. So let's say we wanted to access this only when we are logged in. So we shall add the is authenticated class. When I go ahead and save, when I head over back to our home Insomnia and make this request, we now require to have our authentication credentials. Now, in order for us to basically keep this as allow any, what we need to do is to come and instead of having is authenticated, you can import our allow any permission class and then add it right here so that we can be able to access this even when we are not logged in. So I'm going to save, and when I save, When we go back to our home page right here and I send this, we now see that we can be able to access our Hello World page without having to actually log in into our application. Now, within our post app, we created various views, and we created actually views and used model mixins to handle everything for us. So what I'm going to do is to head over to where we created the view for listing our posts as well as creating them. So right in there, we created this view class that allows us to create as well as list our posts, and in here we added a permission class for is authenticated. So this means we can only access these endpoints, two of the endpoints, the one for getting as well as posting, only when we are logged in. But the problem is we may need to access our endpoint for listing our post objects without having to actually authenticate. So we're going to look at that is authenticated or read only class and how it's going to help us to solve this issue. Now I'm going to go at the top of our code right here, and what I have to do is to import our is authenticated or read only. I'm going to go ahead and save, and when I save, I'm just going to come and change our permission class from is authenticated to is authenticated or read only. When I go ahead and save, when you head over to our insomnia right here, when you go and get all our posts in this case, when I send this, we can be able to actually return them, and we can be able to actually return a list of objects. But when you go and try to create a post, a new post, and we try, let me actually delete our authorization header. When I send this, we now see that we require to access this endpoint only and only if we are authenticated. Now this is the beauty, like we're only having a case where we have to create, and that's only when we have to be logged in. So in case we're actually getting all posts, we can be able to return a list of the posts, but if we are in need to create posts, then we need to log in so as to create those posts. So I'm just going to come right here, and let's say we try to create a new post. Now I'm going to first actually create a JWT, so we're having JSON containing the username as well as the password, actually an email. So this is going to return for us an access token. I'll copy this access token, and when you go where I will create a new post, I'm simply going to go within our headers and I'll add an authorization header right here. So this authorization header will have bearer. It's actually going to be bearer as well as the token that we've created. So when I send this, we'll now see that our post has been created. So let us try to basically access this without our, let's try to access this without our API key or without our authorization header. When we send this, we now see that we can only carry out this request when we are logged in. Now another one is the admin user header, or actually it's our permission class for is admin user, that only gives us access to an endpoint when we are a super user. So what I'm going to do is to try to create a post with a user. Actually, this user is not a super user. So when I try to import that, so let's say we're going to decorate that with his admin user. I'm just going to come and import that class. So it's going to be his admin user. And when I save, I can just come here and say that we shall have our is authenticated or read only, as well as our is admin user. So when I go ahead and save, when you head over right here, try to access this. So I'll provide our authorization header as well as our bearer and our token. So when you try to make this request to create a new post, let's see what happens. So when you send this, we see that we are getting an error of 403 forbidden, as well as a detail of we are not having the permission to perform this action. So this is what happens. Our request will be checked, or this is actually going to run both of our permissions. So it's going to run our is authenticated permission, and it's also going to check if the information of that specific user is for an admin user. So if we remove that permission, so let me actually come and get rid of this permission. Right now, when you send this request, Actually, it seemed like our server is having something wrong. It was restarting. So when we send this, you now see that our post has been created. So that is amazing. So another thing we're going to look at is how we can be able to create our custom post or our custom permission. So to create our custom permission, Django REST Framework provides for us a class that allows us to define how we create our permission. And this allows us to basically override two methods. Those two methods are .has permission and has object permission. So has permission is a method that we override in case our permission is going to basically depend on the request itself. And has object permission is one that is going to allow us access to a given endpoint, given that we are going to depend on an object, as we are going to see. So to create our custom permissions, I'm going to create a separate file within our post app. So I'm going to call this our permissions.py. And within our permissions.py, we're going to create our custom permission class. So we're going to first begin by importing our base permission class from Django REST Framework. So I'll just come and say from REST Framework .permissions, we are going to import our base permission. And right after importing our base permission, I'll simply come and create a class that's going to inherit from our base permission. So let's first create one that's going to allow us to only get or list our objects. So we shall just call this read only. So this is going to allow us to only carry out read requests. Just going to call it read only. And this is going to inherit from our base permission class. So what I'm going to do is to override the function for has permissions. So this has permissions function is one that's going to allow us to only access endpoints when we are getting information from the request itself. So I'll just come right here and define our method as has permission. So this is going to take in self request and then the view for which we're carrying out the request. So I'll do is to actually remove this. So in this case, what we shall need to return is if we're going to create a condition that's going to check if our method for our view is actually in our safe methods. Now, luckily, Django REST Framework permissions provides for us a safe methods variable that is a list of all these methods, which are the get, the head, and the options methods. So I'll have to import it right here by saying safe methods, and then we shall just come and check if our request method is in our safe methods. So I'll just do that by checking if our request dot method is in our safe methods. So this should return true in case we are carrying out a get request, but will return false in case we return a post request. So I'll go in our views right here and I'll begin by importing our permission. So I'll just come and say from dot permissions, we are going to import our read only permission. And right after importing our read only permission, I'm going to just come within our post list create view and then change our permission classes from is authenticated or read only to read only. Now, after having this, I'm just going to come and save. And when we save, I'll go to our Insomnia right here. So when you go to Insomnia, I'm going to try to get all posts. So here, we're going to return all the posts that we have in our database. But when you try to create a post, so I'm going to go where I create a new post. When you try to make a new post, we're going to see that we have no permissions to perform this action. Now, our permission is only allowing us to be able to list our objects, but not allowing us to basically create new objects. So another thing that we need to observe is when you go to our permission classes right here, these classes by default return true, but in case they return false, that means we are actually not satisfying the permission to access a certain endpoint. All right, so there may be cases in which you may want to implement your permissions, just like we've been able to see, but in our case, what we need to implement is a permission for us to carry out certain things if our object for our post is by a certain user. So what do I mean? What we want to do is we want our user to access the object and be able to delete it. And we should not actually allow other users to be able to do things such as updating or deleting our post. So I'm going to come right here, and what I have to do is to implement a class, and this class is going to be author or read only. So in this case, it's going to inherit from our base permission class. And right after doing this, then we shall have to implement our has object permission. So the reason that's why we're doing this is because instead of depending on the request only, we're going to depend on both the request information as well as the object we are trying to update or delete. So I'm just going to come right in here, and what I have to do is to come, and so I'm just going to come right here, and instead of having just a return statement, we're going to basically return if statements and check if our request method is in our safe methods, as well as basically checking if our request user is the object or is the author to the post object we are trying to delete. So to do that, I'll begin by writing an if statement. So shall check if our request dot method is equal to our, actually it's going to be if it's in our safe methods. And right after doing this, then what we shall do is to return true. So this should return true, and if they return false, then that means we are not getting permission to execute that action. So once we do that, then if this passes, then if this fails to pass, or if our if statement fails to pass, what we need to do is to actually return a statement or a boolean to show if our request user is actually the author of that specific object. So we shall do that by returning, and in this case we shall just come and say return request dot user if our request dot user is equal to our object. So in this case we access the author, so we shall just come and say object.author. So when I go ahead and save, we're going to use this on our view for retrieving, updating, and deleting our post object. So I'll just come right here within our views, and within our permission classes, I'll change this from is authenticated to, so I'll just have to actually import our permissions. So I'll just come and say author or read only, and then come right here, and what I have to do is to change this to author or read only. So when I try to save, I'm going to go back to our insomnia right here. So when you try to retrieve a post by its ID, so in this case you see that this is not found, but let's try to see. So when you try to get all our posts, so I'll go where we list all our posts and try to access one that has an ID of 1. So let's try to access one that has an ID of 1. So when I send this, right now we see that we can be able to read it. We have permissions to read it. But let's say when we want to update this post, so I'll just come and provide the ID as ID of 1. And when you come to where we created our JWT, I'm actually going to create a header. So this header, so it's going to actually be our authorization header. Sorry for this. So here we're going to have authorization, and then our value is going to be bearer, and then our token. So when I try to send this, actually this is where I will create our JWT. I think I made a mistake. I'll just delete this. So we want to actually update a post. So I'll do that here by saying authorization, and here we're going to have our bearer as well as our token. So when you try to send this, we now see we don't have permission to perform this action. It seems like this object does not belong to this user. So let us try to create an object that belongs to this user, the current user. So I'll just go where we create a new post and then try to provide our JWT here. And when you try to send, it's actually you do not have permission to perform this action, and I think it's because of the permission you provided that is for read only. So I have to change this to is authenticated or read only. So I'll just come and say, I'm going to say is authenticated or read only. I'll save. So when you go back here, when you try to create a post, this has created a new post. Now let's try to update a post with ID of 17. So when you go where we have a put and we say that we're updating post of ID 17, in this case we see that our post has been updated. But let's say if we try to log in with another user, so I'm going to create a JWT for admin. So I'll just come and say we're going to have our admin at app.com, and then we have our password, which we provide, which I created as this. So when I try to send this, we now see that our access token has been created. But when you try to copy this access token and come back to where we actually basically updated the post, so when I go in our headers and provide our access token here, so when I send this, we're now going to see that this user has no permission to update an object of which they are not the user. The same thing applies to deleting. So if we go where we delete a post and try to delete this post, so I'll come and provide our access token, and when I come here, I'll provide our ID, which is 17. So when I try to send, we'll see that they cannot delete the object because they do not have permissions to access this URL or endpoint. In this video, we've been able to look at permissions. We've covered the basics of permissions. We've also looked at some of the permissions that come inbuilt with the Django REST framework. We've looked at how we can be able to carry out permissions, to implement permissions based on a request as well as those specific to objects. I hope you've learned from this video. And if you like this video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're new. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.